Hi guys, so moving on from last week's video when I talked about the basics of gear and some general buying guide, I'm going to talk about some of the useful but perhaps not essential extra bits of kit like straps, bags, filters, flashes, all that kind of thing. I'm also going to wrap up the entire technical fundamentals course with a few key principles. Now let's get stuck in. So besides those three basics that I really think you ought to get, there are lots of fairly inexpensive but bordering on essential bits I would suggest you buy as well. You've already seen me using one of these, a remote release that plugs into the camera and lets me trigger it without hitting the shutter. Now of course it's enormously helpful for limiting vibrations and helping me get sharp images when I'm on a tripod. It also allows me to trigger the camera from a small distance if, say, somebody's firing golf balls over my head. They can get quite expensive nowadays. This is only a very basic one that basically fires and doesn't fire. You can get ones that have intervalometers on them that let you take number of shots per minute or whatever it might be. In the olden days there were simple screw-in cable release jobs that cost about £5. The cheapest are now between £30 and £50, so for what it is I think it's quite a lot of money. But if you're serious about getting sharp images, particularly with things like landscape, still life work, architectural work, and you're on a tripod, this is pretty much a must. Now sooner or later you're going to want a bag to cart everything round in. If you've only got one camera, one lens, you don't need very much at all. You need something big enough to take some spare batteries and your memory cards. But once you start expanding, you're going to need more and more and more space to carry things around in. Now, as is so often the way, don't make a false economy. Okay, don't think, oh, I'll get the cheapest, nice one I can, because you know what bags and the rest are like. They'll fall apart in absolutely no time. Good brands to look for are Lowepro, Think Tank, Kata, and Manfrotto. I'd also suggest you think carefully about how big your bag is. It's very tempting, as with so many things in life, to go and get the biggest and swankiest you can if you've got the money. However, remember that golden rule from way back of, if you've got all the kit but it's big and bulky, you'll leave it in the car? Yeah, exactly the same with a big heavy camera bag, okay? I would suggest you buy a bag that allows you maybe a little bit of room to expand as you might purchase more kit, but don't go mad and buy something huge if you've only got one camera and a couple of lenses. On the same token, I'd be very wary of buying things online and just going by measurements you get online, because they can be very, very deceptive. Just because the internal measurements of a bag say 30 centimetres by 40 doesn't mean that your kit will necessarily fit. I suggest you go down to the shop with as much of your kit as you can and actually physically try things out. Does that fit in that space? Does that fit in that space? Yes, it does. Away we go. And on the subject of false economies, I've had this for nearly 9 years now. This is a Lowepro all-weather something or other. Don't ask me exactly what it is. It cost about £150. It's now covered in scars and has probably got a couple of years left to go, so it will do in excess of 10 years, no problem. But of course, in that time, it's been on thousands and thousands of shoots, literally thousands, and it's been halfway around the world and back many times over. For a bag, 150 odd pounds is quite a lot to spend, except think what I would have had to have spent if I'd bought cheaper ones. I would have bought them several times over. And even more importantly, this is very good at protecting my camera gear. In and out of overhead lockers and cabins, it's been left outside time after time, it's been soaking wet, it's got muddy, it's got all sorts of crap all over it, and it keeps my gear protected. Okay, there really isn't an option as far as I'm concerned, unless I want to be replacing this sort of stuff, which is even more expensive, much more frequently. Now, unless you never take your camera out of your bag or enjoy expensive repairs, there's another piece of kit that I deem to be essential really, and that's a UV filter. And it's basically a clear glass filter that screws onto the front of your lens, okay? They range in price from 20 to 30 pounds to well over 100. You need to get one that matches the diameter of the end of your lens. And although they reputedly cut down a tiny, tiny amount of the haze you might get with, say, a midday photograph out in the mountains somewhere, what they really do is protect the front of the lens. I work on location a lot of the time, I do lots of action stuff, and I can tell you that has saved so many of my lenses, because something will hit the front of that and it will smash that. Okay, that's 30, 50, 100 pounds I've got to spend to get a new one, but replacing the front element of the lens, that's an awful lot more money. And in some cases might mean replacing the entire lens. So again, don't fall for the false economy thing. This can save you an awful lot of money. Get one for each of your lenses, and you may find, as is the case these days, that you go onto online forums and you research things, you look at stuff, you will hear a handful of people online saying, oh, I never use UV filters, they degrade the quality of my work. Ignore those people. I have been using these for in excess of 20 years. I have never, ever, ever noticed a single bit of difference between using them and not using them in terms of the quality of my work, in terms of the sharpness, the contrast, and so on. What I have noticed though is how expensive it is to repair lenses that get damaged because you haven't got one of these on the front. Now, whilst we're talking about filters, the only other filter that I own, frankly, and use regularly is something called a polarising filter. Now, exactly how this works is a bit tricky to explain and frankly not that useful to know, because in practice what it does is cut down on reflections. Now that of course can be really useful if you're shooting something that is itself very reflective and you don't want to have reflections all over it, so you're shooting something with a very smooth surface, or you're trying to shoot through glass into an interior. A side effect of it cutting down reflections is that it also generally boosts saturation across the shot. That can mean more saturated flowers in a landscape, and it can also make a blue sky incredibly blue. In fact, the effect on blue skies at certain times of day and certain angles can be really quite astounding. It's at its most striking when you are angled at 90 degrees to where the sun is. So you might want to bear that in mind in terms of what time of day you want to shoot something if you're after that effect. And they work by simply rotating within the mount like this until you get the effect you're after. Okay, you'll often find them they've also got a little white mark, and if you're trying to get that maximum sun effect, what you'll find is that's the mark you want to line up with where the sun is. They're not cheap. They come in at around £100 for a decent one, but again, let's not have any false economies. This is a piece of gear that's worth having, it's worth spending proper money on. And they do cut between 1.5 to sometimes 2 stops of light from your exposure, which you need to bear in mind. Okay, they are going to eat light up, you can tell, because it's basically like sunglasses. Look, it's definitely darkening the light coming through. And unless you're using a really, really old camera, you'll need to make sure you get what's called a circular polarising filter, although frankly nowadays they pretty much all are, because if it's not a circular polarising filter, your autofocus system won't work very well. But like I say, you're very unlikely to come across an old-fashioned one anymore anyway, but worth knowing just in case you get caught out on eBay or something. Another really handy piece of kit that's also quite inexpensive is a decent strap. Now, it's pretty certain you've got a strap with your camera when you bought it. I have pretty much never used mine, they've ever come with them. They're okay for stopping the camera falling to the ground, and they tend to scream tourist when they're around your neck because they tend to have camera manufacturer written on them in huge letters. I'd take that off and go and buy yourself a decent one. The biggest reason being not the actual screaming of tourist, although it's perhaps not a great look, it's the fact that hanging a heavy weight around your neck like this can get uncomfortable really, really quickly. And also having a camera body banging away just here isn't very comfortable. What I would suggest, and take it from me as somebody who's been carrying cameras for hours and hours and hours for years and years and years, is get a strap that will place the camera body down by your hip and support the weight there and take the weight across your body. This is a Black Rapid strap. As you can see, a nice, big, wide, comfy strap. It goes over my shoulder and sits down here, and then there's a little knob on the bottom of the camera. I clip that inside there like that, lock it closed, and it sits on my hip. Okay, the weight is now down there. Much, much more comfortable to carry for any length of time, guaranteed. If you're out all day long, it makes a huge difference to your quality of life. Should you end up, as I do, with more than one camera body, photograph an event or something, you can get double straps of these, you have one each side, and you can even, as I've done many times on things like adventure races, take a little climbing carabiner, clip it through there and clip it to your belt so you can actually move around quite quickly and the camera will simply stay put on your waist. But that's an investment well worth making. I believe these proper Black Rapid ones come in at just over £100. I frankly couldn't work without one anymore, but I appreciate it's a bit of money for just a simple strap. You might not say that after a few years of having something hang around your neck, having to go and see an osteopath because your vertebrae are all crushed. So spend the money as soon as you can, I reckon. Now really, I also ought to mention flash. However, having talked about it earlier, I think I've made it clear that this isn't an alleyway we want to go down just yet. I own something in the region of about 5 flash guns, 4 very expensive large flash heads, and over the years I've owned dozens and dozens of these things, let alone the ones that are built into my various cameras. It's a huge topic in its own right, so for the sake of simplicity and convenience, I'm not going to get into much detail. But like any other piece of kit, you can go and buy a £20 one that'll be very, very basic. You can get a fairly high-end one like this that it's £3,500. That sounds good, doesn't it? £3,500, about £350. Or you can spend, like I've done, more than £1,600 on each individual mains flash head. So, I want to wrap up not only that video, but the entire technical fundamentals course. Sticking with gear, I cannot stress enough how important it is that you invest time in yourself and your ideas and your skills more than you invest in equipment. When you're just starting out in photography, I absolutely guarantee you that it'll be your skills and your ideas that will be limiting you, not your equipment. Absolutely fine if in a few months, a few years' time, you start to realise that the equipment you've got, that you just started out with, is limiting your ability to shoot a wider range of stuff or a specific type of shot. At that point, great, go and invest some more money, go and splash some cash. But don't think that equipment is necessarily holding you back, because I'd be fairly confident it isn't. And also, don't fall for the fallacy of having to have the latest and greatest gear, thinking that it's the answer to everything. I'd be fairly confident it won't be. But instead, the same amount of money and time invested in coming up with better ideas and developing your craft will yield much, much better results.